Picture this. A military base deep in the Saudi desert, surrounded by miles of empty land, protected by some of the most advanced missile defense systems ever built. F-35 stealth fighters sit on the tarmac. American airmen walk the flight line. Patriot batteries scan the skies. This is Prince Sultan Air Base, the crown jewel of America's military presence in the Arabian Peninsula, reopened just 7 years ago specifically to deter Iran. And then one night, in the first days of March 2026, the radar screens lit up. Not one missile, not two. A coordinated wave of ballistic missiles and drones tracking directly toward that base, toward the American personnel inside it, and toward the aircraft that America needed most to fight this war. Iran had just turned the very base designed to stop it into its primary target. And what happened next will change the Middle East, the global energy market, and the balance of world power for decades to come. Stay with me, because what Iran did next at the Strait of Hormuz will shake every economy on the planet. And we will get there. But first, you need to understand exactly how the world arrived at this moment, and why the greatest military superpower in history found itself watching its most important regional asset absorb Iranian fire on live satellite feeds. To understand the full weight of what is happening right now, you have to go back to the decision that started all of this. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated strike on Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of senior Iranian officials in a single night. It was the most consequential single military operation since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Washington called it the beginning of a new era of Middle Eastern security. Tehran called it an act of war. And within hours, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated what military analysts had warned about for years: a carefully prepared, pre-positioned multi-axis retaliation plan targeting not just Israel, but every single American military installation in the region simultaneously. The IRGC made its position crystal clear in a public statement released that same day: all U.S. assets throughout the region were now considered legitimate targets. Every base, every forward operating position, every American uniform within range of an Iranian missile. Now here is where the story takes a turn that even the most seasoned geopolitical analysts did not fully anticipate. Saudi Arabia had publicly told both Washington and Tehran that it would not allow its territory or airspace to be used to attack Iran. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself personally informed Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian of this position. The kingdom made its official policy crystal clear. Riyadh wanted a peaceful diplomatic resolution to the crisis and would remain out of direct military involvement. In a closed-door briefing in Washington, Saudi Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman had said privately that Trump should take military action against Iran. But publicly, Saudi Arabia's position was non-participation. And yet, sitting on Saudi soil, in the heart of the kingdom, was Prince Sultan Air Base, home to American F-35A Lightning II stealth fighters, American F-16 Fighting Falcons, and critically, American aerial refueling tankers, the KC-135 Stratotankers that America's entire air campaign over Iran depended upon. This is the contradiction that Iran chose to exploit. Iran's logic was precise and brutal. If American aircraft are launching from your territory, using your airspace, and refueling over your land, on their way to bomb Iranian cities and kill Iranian leaders, then you are a participant in this war, regardless of what your foreign ministry says, and Iran decided to act accordingly. In the opening days of the conflict, Prince Sultan Air Base was struck by coordinated waves of Iranian ballistic missiles. Saudi Arabia's air defenses intercepted many of them, but not all. 5 American Air Force refueling tankers were damaged in the initial strikes, and then more followed. By the time the dust had settled, at least 7 American aerial tankers had been struck or damaged, a rate of attrition that Pentagon planners described privately as alarming. Those tankers were irreplaceable in the short term. The Boeing KC-46A Pegasus replacement program had been plagued by delays and cost overruns. Congress had blocked the retirement of older KC-135s just months earlier, a decision that, in retrospect, may have prevented an even larger operational crisis. Think carefully about what those damaged tankers mean strategically. An F-35 or an F-15 Strike Eagle can only fly as far as its fuel allows. Without aerial refueling, America's ability to sustain round-the-clock bombing missions over Iranian territory hundreds of miles away is drastically reduced. Iran understood this. The IRGC did not attack Prince Sultan Air Base out of rage or emotion. They attacked it with surgical strategic intent, targeting the specific capability that made America's air campaign viable over long distances. And they used Saudi Arabia's own territory to make a devastating political and military statement at the same time. Nowhere that hosts American forces is safe from Iranian retaliation. Saudi Arabia found itself in a position that MBS had never intended. The kingdom had not wanted this war. It had lobbied for military action against Iran's nuclear program and its leadership. yes, but it had also publicly distanced itself from any direct military role. Now Iranian missiles were landing on Saudi soil, striking American assets in Saudi facilities, and killing people of Indian and Bangladeshi nationality who were working in the communities around Al-Kharj. 2 people were killed when an Iranian drone struck a residential building near the base. The U.S. Embassy in Riyadh was struck by 2 Iranian drones on March 3rd, causing a fire. Iranian drones repeatedly targeted Saudi Arabia's Sheba oil field deep in the Rub al-Khali Desert, one of the kingdom's most critical oil production sites. The message from Tehran was as clear as it was chilling. We know exactly where your most valuable infrastructure is. We can reach all of it. Meanwhile, Iran was not limiting its retaliation to Saudi Arabia alone. Simultaneously, on that same night of February 28th, the IRGC launched what can only be described as the most comprehensive multi-theater military operation in Iranian history. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, America's largest air base in the entire Middle East, home to the combined air operations center that commands all U.S. air power across the region, was hit by 44 missiles and 8 drones in the opening salvo. Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait was struck. Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates was targeted. The U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain was hit. Every single American military installation of significance across the entire Arabian Peninsula was struck simultaneously. Iran had spent years mapping, studying, and pre-targeting every American base in the region, and on the night of February 28th, they executed that plan. By March 5th, the scale of the Iranian campaign had become almost incomprehensible. The United Arab Emirates alone reported that 1,072 drones and 204 missiles had targeted its territory. Bahrain reported approximately 70 missiles and 59 drones. Kuwait announced that 178 missiles and 384 drones had been launched toward its country. Qatar reported 120 missiles and 53 drones, and these numbers kept climbing. But by March 8th, the UAE was reporting that 1,422 drones and 246 missiles had been launched at its territory, numbers that reflected a sustained industrial-scale missile campaign that no Gulf air defense system was fully designed to absorb indefinitely. Iran was not just retaliating. Iran was conducting a war of strategic attrition across the entire Gulf simultaneously, stretching every missile defense battery, every radar system, and every interceptor stockpile to its absolute limit. President Trump told CNN on camera that the Iranian attacks in the Gulf had been the biggest surprise of the conflict for him. He had expected the Gulf states to stay on the sidelines, and instead, they found themselves absorbing the heaviest sustained missile bombardment in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. Gulf states closed their airspace. Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE all temporarily shut down air navigation. The economic consequences began cascading immediately, because every major Gulf airport, every major port, and every major oil terminal was now inside the envelope of Iranian missile range, and Iran was demonstrating that it was willing to use that range aggressively. Now, and this is where the story truly expands beyond the military domain into something that touches every single person watching this video, regardless of where you live, we need to talk about what Iran did to the Strait of Hormuz. Because while the missile salvos on Gulf bases were dramatic and historically significant, the move that Iran made at the Strait is the one that will define this era of history for generations. On March 2nd, 2026, a senior IRGC official publicly confirmed on the record, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Not threatened, closed. And the IRGC declared that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be considered a legitimate military target. But the IRGC spokesperson put it in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. The price of oil depends on regional security, and you are the main source of insecurity in the region. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. $200 per barrel. Now consider this. The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through those 21 miles, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. That represents approximately 20% of the entire global oil supply. It also carries enormous volumes of liquefied natural gas, roughly 19% of the world's LNG supply, primarily from Qatar, bound for energy. Hungry markets in Asia and Europe. When Iran closed the strait, it did not just cut off a shipping lane. It reached into every home, every factory, every gas station, and every power grid on the planet simultaneously. This is the economic weapon that Iran had been holding in reserve for decades, and on March 4, 2026, it deployed it without hesitation. The immediate market response was exactly what anyone who understood energy economics would have predicted. Brent crude, which had been trading around $70 per barrel before the conflict began, surged by 10 to 13% in the opening days. By March 8th, Brent crossed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, and it kept moving higher, reaching $126 per barrel at its peak before emergency reserve releases from global governments provided temporary relief. Goldman Sachs published analysis estimating that traders were demanding approximately $14 more per barrel than before the conflict began just to compensate for the elevated risk. Asian stock markets in Tokyo, Seoul, and Hong Kong opened sharply lower following Wall Street losses. The U.S. consumer price index, which had been showing progress toward the Federal Reserve's inflation targets, was now threatened with a complete reversal. Gasoline prices in the United States crossed $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023. American families, who had been feeling economic pressure from previous years of inflation, were suddenly facing a new shock at the pump driven entirely by a geopolitical conflict 7,000 miles away. The International Energy Agency moved immediately to coordinate an emergency release of 400 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserves of member nations. Japan released 80 million barrels from its national and private reserves. European countries complied with the coordinated release. The United States drew on its strategic petroleum reserve, which held 415 million barrels before the war. But here's the brutal mathematics of the situation that no government wanted to say out loud in those early weeks. 400 million barrels of emergency oil sounds like an enormous number until you do the arithmetic. Global oil consumption runs at approximately 105 million barrels per day. 400 million barrels covers just 4 days of total global consumption. And against the normal daily traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, 20 million barrels per day, it covers only about 20 days of typical flows. The reserve release could calm markets temporarily. It could provide a psychological cushion. But it could not replace the fundamental function of a working, open Strait of Hormuz. Experts from the Al Jazeera economic desk were explicit about this. The reserve release would remain limited as long as the fundamental problem, the freedom of supply and tanker movement through Hormuz, remained unresolved. European natural gas prices nearly doubled almost overnight. This was driven by a specific and devastating event. On March 2nd, Iranian drones attacked Qatari gas facilities, and Qatar Energy announced that all gas production in the country had been halted. Qatar provides 12 to 14% of Europe's LNG supply. Suddenly, European governments that had only recently stabilized their energy situation after years of managing the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine energy shock found themselves facing an entirely new supply emergency. Countries began announcing emergency fuel-saving measures. In Asia, the situation was even more acute. Around 80% of Asia's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Vietnam had oil reserves estimated to last less than 20 days. Pakistan and Indonesia maintained reserves of around 20 days. The Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Brunei depend on imports for between 60 and 95% of their crude supply. Governments across Asia closed schools, told workers to stay home, and asked citizens to adopt fuel-saving measures as they braced for the price shocks to ripple through every sector of their economies simultaneously. The U.S. Energy Information Administration projected that the war would cut global oil supply by approximately 8 million barrels per day in March alone. The shipping industry effectively ceased operating through the strait. War risk insurance premiums reached 6-year highs, making transit economically unviable for most commercial operators, even when they were technically willing to attempt it. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre reported 10 attacks on ships attempting to transit the strait by March 8th, killing 5 crew members across 2 vessels. Amazon Web Services data centers in the UAE were struck and damaged by drone attacks, causing significant infrastructure outages across the Middle Eastern internet corridor, demonstrating that Iran's targeting was not limited to military and energy infrastructure, but extended to the digital infrastructure that underpinned modern Gulf commercial life. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous, and why the geopolitical consequences extend far beyond the immediate military situation, is what Iran's closure of the strait represents in terms of the architecture of global trade. The economists describing this crisis as the worst energy disruption since the 1970s are not being hyperbolic. The 1973 oil embargo caused a global recession. The 1979 Iranian Revolution triggered a second major energy crisis that reshaped Western industrial policy for a generation. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is, by any objective measure, the largest disruption to global oil markets in the history of the modern energy economy. Iran has not just closed a shipping lane, it has weaponized the global economy itself, turning the world's dependence on Gulf energy into a direct instrument of strategic leverage against the United States and its allies. And the geopolitical dimensions go even deeper than the energy markets. While American and European ships cannot transit the strait, China is in a fundamentally different position. China had stockpiled crude oil before the war began, giving it a strategic buffer. China's partnership with Iran and Russia has allowed it to continue importing pipeline natural gas from Russia over land, bypassing the strait entirely. Chinese-flagged vessels have reportedly been allowed to continue moving through the strait, even while Iran blocks Western shipping. And in perhaps the most significant long-term development of this entire crisis, Iranian officials told CNN that Tehran was weighing allowing cargoes, traded in Chinese yuan, to transit through the Strait of Hormuz, even while US dollar-denominated cargoes remain blocked. If that policy solidifies, it would represent a fundamental restructuring of global energy pricing, driving oil trade toward yuan-denominated transactions and directly challenging the petrodollar system that has underpinned American economic power since the 1970s. This is the scenario that the de-dollarization analysts and the BRICS watchers have been warning about for years. Not a gradual diplomatic transition away from dollar dominance, but a sudden war-driven rupture in the financial architecture of global energy. Back in Saudi Arabia, the strategic calculus was being recalculated in real time. The Atlantic Council published analysis noting that Iran had demonstrated relative restraint toward Saudi Arabia in the opening 48 hours, launching just 2 attacks compared to over 150 missiles and 500 drones against the UAE. The reason was cold strategic logic. Tehran calculated that Saudi Arabia was the Gulf state most likely to respond militarily, so it held back while it assessed the situation. But that restraint ended on March 2nd, when Iran made the decision to escalate against Saudi infrastructure directly. Iranian drones targeted the massive Aramco refinery at Ras Tanura on March 4th, the facility that processes and exports a massive share of Saudi Arabia's oil production. Saudi air defenses intercepted the attack before the drones reached the facility, but the message was unambiguous. Iran was now willing to strike at the economic heart of Saudi Arabia's global importance. Gulf states rallied together in the face of the Iranian assault, demonstrating that even amid political tensions between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in the preceding months, Gulf solidarity remained durable under genuine military pressure. Saudi Arabia and the UAE made clear that Iranian attacks had crossed a fundamental red line and that they reserved the right to respond. Several Gulf states quietly began pressing Washington not to stop the military campaign short, not because they had pushed for the war in the first place, but because they now feared that leaving Iran with significant missile capabilities and weapons production capacity would simply mean a repeat of this crisis in the future, but with an Iran that had learned exactly where all the vulnerabilities were. NATO fractures have become impossible to ignore throughout this crisis. Germany declared it would not participate. The European Union stated it had no appetite for troop deployments. Trump lashed out publicly at NATO allies and at Japan, Australia, and South Korea for not supporting U.S. operations to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. The alliance that America had counted on for collective defense in every major crisis since 1949 is now visibly struggling to find consensus on a conflict that directly threatens European energy security. The United Kingdom told the U.S. it could use British bases for defensive operations, but drew limits around offensive strikes. Turkey opposed American military action entirely and offered to mediate. This is not a united Western alliance facing a regional challenger. This is a fragmented coalition of nations, each calculating its own economic exposure and political risk in real time. And through all of this, the question that no one in Washington, Riyadh, Doha, or Abu Dhabi can yet answer is the one that matters most. How does this end? Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of using the U.S. Navy to escort commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but the Pentagon has been cautious about committing to that operation given the risks posed by Iranian anti-ship missiles in the narrow waterway. The U.S. Energy Secretary said on March 13th that the Navy was not yet ready to begin escorts, but that operations could begin by the end of the month. 13 days into the war, despite the firepower the United States and Israel were raining down on Iranian territory, the strait remained effectively closed. Markets and the global economy remained vulnerable, and Iran was making clear that it intended to keep them that way. What began as a targeted American and Israeli military operation against Iranian nuclear facilities and leadership has evolved into something far larger, far more complex, and far more consequential than any initial planning assumed. The Gulf states that privately wanted Iran weakened now find themselves absorbing direct missile attacks on their own soil. The American military presence that was supposed to project deterrence from bases like Prince Sultan Air Base is now those bases themselves being deterred by Iranian missile campaigns. The energy architecture that has powered the global economy for decades is under its most severe threat since the 1970s. And the financial system built around the dollar's dominance in global oil pricing faces a challenge from the Yuan-Hormuz framework that Iran and China appear to be constructing in real time. Here is the revelation that this entire story has been building toward. Saudi Arabia thought it could host American military power without becoming a target. It thought it could be the behind-the-scenes architect of a conflict it would not officially join. It thought that geography, diplomacy, and a carefully managed public position would protect it from the consequences of decisions it was quietly shaping. Iran has dismantled every one of those assumptions with precision-guided missiles and coordinated drone strikes. Prince Sultan Air Base was reopened in 2019. It took 7 years, the shortest cycle in any American basing history anywhere in the world, to go from reopening to absorbing Iranian missile fire. The acceleration reflects one simple truth that the architects of the Gulf Security Order chose not to fully confront. When you host military power that is actively being used to strike your neighbor will eventually reach the rational conclusion that you are a participant in the conflict. And Iran reached that conclusion on February 28, 2026. The world is now watching the consequences unfold in real time. In oil markets, in global shipping lanes, in the bank accounts of ordinary families paying more for fuel and food and electricity, and in the military headquarters of nations that are rapidly recalculating everything they thought they understood about how power works in the modern Middle East. The betrayal that this story is about is not just Saudi Arabia's quiet support for a war it publicly denied joining. It is also the betrayal of an assumption. The assumption that military power can be projected from someone else's territory without consequences for that territory. That energy markets can be secured by force without the possibility that the force itself destabilizes the markets, and that the Strait of Hormuz would always remain open because everyone understood that closing it would be catastrophic. Iran understood all of that perfectly. And it closed the strait anyway, because sometimes the most powerful strategic move available is demonstrating that you are willing to do the thing that everyone assumed you never would. The question of what comes next, whether the U.S. Navy escorts tankers through Iranian missile range, whether Saudi Arabia formally enters the conflict, whether the yuan begins pricing oil while the dollar watches from the sidelines, whether this war reshapes the Middle East the way the 1979 Iranian Revolution did, or the way the 2003 invasion of Iraq did, those questions do not yet have answers. But the question of how the world arrived at this moment and why American bases in Saudi Arabia became Iran's prime target now has a very clear answer. They became the target because they were the target all along. Tehran just waited for the right moment to make that reality impossible to ignore. And now consider what the long-term implications are for the entire framework of American military basing in the region. The Atlantic Council noted that Gulf states are increasingly questioning the cost-benefit calculus of hosting U.S. military installations. The analysis is not complicated. Before February 28th, American bases provided deterrence. They were the reason Iran had to think twice before moving against Gulf states. After February 28th, American bases became magnets for Iranian missiles, turning every host nation into a participant in a conflict it had publicly and genuinely tried to avoid. The Cato Institute had argued as far back as 2003 that American troops in Saudi Arabia were superfluous and dangerous. Still, the 2026, war has made that argument impossible to dismiss. If the war extends beyond its initial timeline, or if Iranian strikes on Saudi soil produce casualties at a scale that Saudi public opinion cannot absorb, the political pressure on MBS to demand a withdrawal of American forces could become very difficult to resist, regardless of what the private strategic calculation says. There is also the dimension of this conflict that rarely gets discussed in mainstream analysis, but that every energy economist and central banker is watching with acute anxiety: the long-term structural damage to Gulf energy investment. War risk assessments do not simply reset to zero the moment a ceasefire is declared. Insurance underwriters, shipping companies, energy infrastructure investors, and the sovereign wealth funds that finance Gulf development projects will now permanently recalibrate their risk models for the entire region. The idea that the Gulf is a stable platform for long-term energy investment, an idea that underpinned trillions of dollars of capital allocation over the past 2 decades, has taken a blow that will outlast the immediate military conflict. When insurance premiums reach 6-year highs and shipping companies suspend Gulf operations, those are not decisions that reverse overnight once the shooting stops. The market's memory of what happened to Prince Sultan Air Base, to Al Udeid, to the Ras Tanura refinery attempt, to the Amazon Web Services data centers in the UAE, will be priced into Gulf risk assessments for years. And then there is the dimension of this story that brings it directly home to every American, every European, every Asian citizen watching from thousands of miles away. The world had grown accustomed over decades to a kind of invisible guarantee, an implicit promise that the oil would flow, that the tankers would move, that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open because the global economy could not function if it did not. That invisible guarantee was backed by the U.S. Navy, by the threat of American military force, and by the calculation that even Iran understood it could not afford the consequences of shutting down global energy. That invisible guarantee is now gone. Iran demonstrated in March 2026 that it was willing to absorb relentless American and Israeli airstrikes and still close the strait anyway. The deterrent failed, and when deterrents fail publicly and visibly, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate conflict. Every country, every adversary, every strategic competitor of the United States is watching carefully and drawing its own conclusions about what American military power can and cannot prevent in the modern world. The Saudi desert is quiet at dawn. The Patriot batteries continue their vigil. The radar screens continue scanning. The American airmen at Prince Sultan still walk the flight line, still do their jobs, still project the posture of a military force that cannot be intimidated. But the missiles have already come. The tankers have already been struck. The strait is already closed. And the world that existed before February 28, 2026, the world in which American military basing in the Gulf was a source of stability rather than a target list, that world is not coming back. What replaces it is still being written, one missile, salvo at a time, across the skies of the Arabian Peninsula, over the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, and in the trading floors and central bank meeting rooms of every economy on earth that runs on oil. The quiet betrayal is not just Saudi Arabia's, it is the betrayal of a strategic order that the entire world depended on, and that nobody in the end was willing to defend at the price that defending it required.